You've spoken honestly about the possibility of war between US and China in the long term, if no diplomatic solution is found. How do we avoid the trajectory where these two superpowers clash?
With almost 6,000 machines orbiting around the world today, Starlink undoubtedly has the largest number of satellites in the world. But while many view Starlink as nothing more than a famous billionaire's attempt to make more money, China's top authorities see it as a potential threat to national security. This perception led to a recent cyber attack on the network, leaving many mysteries unsolved. Why would they see Starlink as a potential threat, and how did they pull off the attack? Join us as we investigate China's recent attack on Starlink, as revealed by Elon Musk. China's attack on Starlink. On January 15, 2025, the South China Morning Post put out a report that made headlines across the East. According to the report, Wu Yunhua, one of China's leading experts in astronautics, had successfully simulated an operation using less than 100 Chinese satellites to disable almost 2,000 Starlink satellites for over 12 hours. A whole study was published on this, and the plan was so brilliant that it got featured in the Chinese academic journal. With this planned operation getting a lot of attention, it is no wonder Elon Musk has spoken out about it. Elon states that he knows the technologies they plan to use against his satellites, and though they sound advanced but harmless on the surface, he insists that they are dangerous weapons in disguise. According to Elon, these weapons are designed to use lasers and microwaves to target satellites, and that wasn't even the scariest part. What made Elon so frightened was that these satellites were designed to run on a highly advanced binary AI algorithm based on the brilliant way whales hunt. This is usually done by luring fish into small areas where they can easily get caught. In the same way, this new program is designed to move Chinese satellites in ways that target hundreds of satellites through single direct attacks. On top of that, Wu Yunhua, the brilliant mind behind this operation, promises that this would be done in less than 2 minutes and with 99 smaller units required to take down 1,500 Starlink satellites. Elon's entire network of almost 6,000 satellites could be taken down in less than a day with just 4 consecutive attacks. With this in mind, it is no wonder Elon had to speak out about this, as he had made it clear on multiple occasions that he didn't want trouble with China.
And everyone's like, well, that's inevitable that there's going to be a clash between Athens and Sparta. Well, how do we avoid that?
Despite this, it seems Wu Yunhua and the many other leading astronautic engineers in China are hell-bent on doing the opposite. As of late last year, they were disrupting his satellites along with Russia by repeatedly jamming signals and launching casual cyber attacks almost every week. Now they are going all in with more advanced tools, including high-power microwave tools like the relativistic klystron amplifier and solid-state lasers. Based on the report published by the South China Morning Post, this operation would have destroyed a huge chunk of Elon's satellites by now. The problem is that these technologies have very strong limitations. One problem is that RKA amplifiers require high amounts of energy to target multiple satellites at the same time, and that in turn leads to overheating. It then takes several hours for these systems to cool down, giving enough time for Elon to fight back if he wishes to. Knowing the bigger problems that might arise after the next hit, it leads us to the big question. Why attack Starlink? To most people in the West, Elon Musk is just a guy trying to make a quick buck by building more satellites to make the internet more accessible. But to most Chinese authorities and experts, the tech billionaire poses a potential threat. To them, multiple problems come to mind, like military security, technological superiority, control of information, and space management. While Starlink's group of over 6,000 satellites is built for civilians who want nothing more than to have a stable internet connection, a closer look at the network shows that it is capable of much more than that. This was very obvious during the peak of the conflict in Ukraine, where the internet connection granted by Starlink gave the native soldiers an advantage over the Russian invaders. This alone made the Chinese authorities perceive Starlink as something potentially more dangerous than the average tech business, leading to the simulation of how to destroy it. Because of this, while Elon likely saw the Ukrainian soldiers as just another group of customers buying his product, the Chinese Republic thought he was picking sides by using Starlink to get involved in a war that had nothing to do with him. It raised alarms within the Chinese military, as it was clear that Starlink could be used as a tool by the US military against the Republic. From more efficient sharing of intel and faster recon missions to more secure modes of communication, There were many ways these satellites could be used against them. As far as they were concerned, the fact that the US military could have considered this and placed no restrictions implied that they didn't have China's best interests at heart, especially considering that they are already in a Cold War in space exploration. With private US companies now having more influence over space activities that could be used by their military, it almost implies that they have lost the war already. This is a hard pill to swallow, especially for a country that prides itself on being a leading frontier in all things tech-related. Besides that, Starlink hasn't had the best history with cybersecurity, with multiple attacks reportedly coming from the average hackers who work from home. Because of this, many leading programmers through the years have pointed out several exploits and vulnerabilities within the network's code. This was most obvious on August 10, 2022, when Leonard Wouters, a programmer who worked at KU Leuven, hacked his Starlink terminal with code that could potentially hack a satellite. Contrary to what you might expect, unlike today, Leonard had no pedigree when it came to his job back then. He was just as skilled as the next guy, but single-handedly revealed one of the first security breakdowns of a Starlink user terminal. These small devices are usually positioned on people's rooftops where they can get signals from the nearest Starlink satellites in orbit. Wanting the world to see this, Leonard waited until the famous Black Hat Security Conference, known back then as the best place for hackers and security officials across the world. According to Wired, the process was so simple that Leonard broke down the new terminal on stage before attaching a special mod chip he built with off-the-shelf parts that cost a total of about $25. Once he attached it to the Starlink dish, it was able to bypass all security protocols within seconds. This granted him free access to the internet with no payment restrictions. It could be now used freely wherever, whenever, forever, and the audience was amazed by how easy it was to hack. To further prove it was real, he uploaded the code to GitHub and made it open source. Leonard believed the code was in its earliest stages and could be used to attack the satellite itself. He also pointed out the possibility of building a system that could let him talk to the satellite and make life much easier for himself. What made it interesting was that Leonard had notified Starlink about the flaws since early 2021, urging them to do something about it. According to Leonard, all they did was make it harder to do, and all he had to do was change the mod chip, and the system was just as vulnerable as it was before. He told the engineers at SpaceX that the best way to fix the issue is by creating a new version of the main chip, as every terminal out there was vulnerable. It is a hardware issue, he said, not something that can be fixed with the average software update. SpaceX revealed that they were working on it, and nobody knows to this day whether it worked or not. Also, keep in mind that China has always desired to be self-reliant, and with a private US company offering a product that could appeal to Chinese users, it stands to reason that Starlink is a potential threat to their digital structure. This is because digital systems controlled by foreigners can easily bypass their state control systems, and knowing the country's reputation with handling user data through apps like TikTok, it is clear that having Starlink satellites hovering over China is something they cannot allow. This problem of handling personal data was most evident in 2020, when rumors suggested the platform would get banned in the US. This was because the Chinese company behind TikTok refused to adjust how they collected and used private information about users. This showed how much they valued having control over all information networks, as they were under strict rules from the Chinese government to maintain complete control over all the info that got within its borders, including sensitive data from American users. Let's also not forget that Elon's network promises to provide unrestricted access to the internet without censorship, a wild promise that goes against the strict censorship rules that China is known for. And with many Chinese citizens showing a growing interest in Starlink, it is almost no wonder why the state sees every sign of progress as a potential threat. Besides that, though the state authorities haven't said anything about competing with Starlink, it is safe to say that China also plans to launch thousands of satellites in the near future. And with Elon's satellites doing the same thing, it also brings up the issue of space congestion. And here is the big concern. As of today, there are over 11,300 satellites surrounding the Earth, and almost 6,000 of them belong to Starlink. Besides the valid concern of having 6,000 satellites belonging to a single US citizen, with several of these machines floating close to the Earth, chances are China's future satellites would collide with at least one of them in the coming years. The increased number of satellites in space would make launching new spacecraft more difficult in the near future. Many scenarios would pose a lot of problems. What if one of these satellites China plans to launch is strictly for the military and a US machine happens to coll with it? How would both sides interpret such an event? Right now, there are concerns about how the US Navy is depending too much on Starlink, as it's almost hard to draw the line between Elon's private network and the military. Here is what we mean. Starlink and the military. Just as a knife in the right hands can cut bread and spread butter for food, in the wrong hands it can also cause serious harm. This seems to be the growing concern with how the US military has been relying too much on Starlink to improve communication in the most critical missions. With a powerful resource like Starlink now being used by authorities known for using extreme measures to protect the peace, an average product made for everybody can almost be classified as a weapon. They rely so much on it that whenever US soldiers go on missions to remote places without cell towers, the only way they can keep in touch with comrades and authorities is by using Starlink. The US Navy first tested the network on its ships to give sailors better connection while they were at sea, and not only was it useful in knowing their status at all times, it also helped them keep in touch with their families. This happened in April 2023, and soon other branches of the military tried it out as well. Higher officials were surprised by the huge difference it made with how well the soldiers performed. Now able to communicate with their families after every mission, the fighting soldiers had a much stronger motivation to survive, leading to a higher rate of success. This was demonstrated by Aircraft Commander Dwight Eisenhower during his first experience with Starlink. According to the commander, he and his comrades were deployed last year for over 9 months in the Middle East, and the one thing that kept smiles on their faces in the face of danger was the hope of reconnecting with their families every time they returned to base. Beyond that, it also made administrative tasks faster and easier. With many features so impressive and a lot of lives at stake, relying on Starlink for all digital protocols seemed to be the best option they had. As of now, there are no better communication technologies provided by the US government for the military that can compete with Starlink. And given the current nature of most operations, it's clear that going back to the old ways would come at a heavy cost, one which the military cannot afford right now. Despite this, a lot of people still remain concerned, with many reporters reaching out to officials in the Pentagon to know how much influence Elon has in the Defense Department. But to this day, the officials have not responded. Things got so bad that 2 US senators, Jack Reed and Jeanne Shaheen, in the Senate Armed Services Committee, asked the Department of Justice and Department of Defense to investigate Elon Musk. Seeing Elon as a businessman willing to provide services to any potential customer, they were afraid he might be signing exclusive contracts with Russian authorities, but that wasn't all. Both senators also wanted to make sure that the Pentagon had put strict restrictions to prevent him from doing so. With this in mind, the U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin III began his investigation into Elon's case in early December last year, and the legal process is still ongoing. While there was trouble within the U.S. authorities over this, China was getting involved as well, as they noticed how Starlink's increasing network of satellites was getting more integrated with the U.S. military. Starlink and the U.S. military had become so intertwined that if anything happened to Starlink satellites on a large scale, it would effectively disrupt the military's ability to communicate. As a result, having 6,000 Starlink satellites in space effectively meant having 6,000 U.S. military assets hovering on standby over every country, including China. As far-reaching as it sounds for a country as powerful as China, this would not have been the natural conclusion if not for one major event that happened back in early 2022, the Ukraine invasion. On February 24, 2022, Ukraine was invaded by Russian forces. To delay all forms of support from the outside world, the invaders destroyed all local network infrastructures, effectively blocking internet access for a lot of people. Not long after the invasion began, several Ukrainian delegates asked for support from SpaceX to make Starlink available in their country. Elon, at this point, didn't want problems with Russia, but he was also a businessman, so he agreed to send help. In less than a week, thousands of Starlink units were brought into the country from SpaceX's headquarters. Many people got their hands on them, including trusted government authorities. Now having a reliable means of communication, the natives quickly got the upper hand and were able to push back against the invaders for a few months. While Starlink was available in Ukraine, it was only restricted to certain regions. So 6 months later, the native authorities reached out, asking Elon to make the service available to other regions within the country. One place where they needed this the most was in Crimea, a place where they would be able to launch a direct attack against the invaders, but to their surprise, Elon's answer was no. Contrary to what they thought, Elon wasn't supporting them in their struggle, as he allegedly didn't want trouble from the opposing side. Because of this, most natives thought he was in cahoots with the invaders, but that wasn't the case, as he never supported nations that were sanctioned by the US. What they didn't know was that Elon was now under the watchful eye of Chinese authorities who interpreted his supply of Starlink to the natives as a sign that he was siding with them. Things weren't good in the US either, as people on the internet began to see him as someone who chose making money over helping those in need. Keep in mind that this happened after Elon had made it clear he was only focusing on selling his products and nothing more, implying that he was being accused from all sides for things he didn't do. From that moment until late 2024, the invaders had used every trick in their arsenal to disrupt the internet service. We are talking about jamming radio frequencies and causing widespread outages. Each time they tried to block Starlink, the network would get restored just a few days later. And the cycle happened so many times that it became a game of cat and mouse between the Russian hackers and the experts at SpaceX. Though all their attempts to attack Starlink failed, there was more trouble on the horizon as China was now getting involved, and this was confirmed by the Royal United Services Institute in April last year. Given the events that unfolded from that moment, it is clear that the recent cyber attack from China wasn't the first incident, as from May last year, there were many movements when satellites suddenly went off for minutes before getting back to normal. At first glance, the engineers at SpaceX thought it was a routine malfunction that came with the much older satellites. But with multiple newer satellites experiencing the same thing a few days later, it was clear there was a cyber attack. The big question was, where did it come from? It didn't align with how the Russians had attacked the network for over 2 years, implying that those behind it were most likely not part of the invaders. Without a better explanation, all eyes turned to the next big country that could afford such technology, and that was China. Verified reports also suggest they have yet another frightening plan on the horizon, the Guo-Wang project. This initiative is part of China's plan to create a large group of satellites in space to provide internet services all over the world. While this project sounds just like Starlink, a closer look shows that it has many differences. Firstly, it is a government-led initiative, implying that it isn't owned and operated by a private company. Instead, it is owned and managed by the China Satellite Network Group, a firm that is entirely owned by the state. Even though its main aim is to provide access to the internet, the Guo-Wang project also aims to provide better services than Starlink for citizens of the state, so they wouldn't need to rely on foreign technologies while also being able to work on a global scale. This way, they would do everything Starlink does while also maintaining their strict censorship rules. But that doesn't mean it would be smaller in comparison. The last statement released by the China Satellite Network Group implies that they plan to launch 13,000 satellites, with ongoing plans to launch 500 by December. By comparison, Starlink has almost 6,000 in orbit and plans to release a total of over 40,000. To make up for that, the Guo-Wang initiative plans to allow different private companies to join in as well, including leading research institutions to figure out how the service could be used beyond accessing the internet on a personal device. This means Guo-Wang would likely be used in disaster management, environmental monitoring, and scientific research. While Starlink launched as a private initiative that has a single goal in mind supported by the public and military, China's big project seems to go far beyond that. The big problem is that it presents some of the same issues they once associated with Starlink. From their perspective, since the US has chosen to support Elon's growing network of potential weapons without considering the safety of other countries, it is now time for China to do its own thing without considering them as well. While the US also remains ambiguous about where the line is drawn between Starlink and the military, China launches their project as a government initiative, implying that it is built to support the military, just as it supports other things like healthcare, transport, research, and entertainment. Then comes the issue of space congestion, especially considering how the increasing number of satellites each year increases the risk of collisions. Right now, over 11,300 satellites are hovering around us, and both sides plan to increase that number by over 400% before 2030. If this goes unchecked within the next 5 years, after multiple unavoidable collisions, our planet will suffer from the dreaded Kessler syndrome, a situation where the Earth's orbit becomes so filled with satellite junk that it becomes too dangerous to launch anything beyond the atmosphere. With multiple countries blindly competing against one another, there are no international guidelines that place limits on things like this. If China succeeds with this plan, chances are they will establish sovereignty over all space-based communications. What Russia failed to accomplish during the Cold War would happen 5 years from now, leading to significant issues with the global balance of power in space infrastructure. The only way to go ahead of this would be by bringing Elon's dreams of colonizing Mars to reality, but that on its own is problematic enough for another video. With over 10,000 satellites belonging to China, there will be another huge problem we'll have to deal with. This issue is what physicists call spectrum allocation. To put it simply, most satellite communications are carried out through an ocean of radio waves, which needs to be split into different parts to avoid interference. We use radio waves here on Earth, but they are split into different parts for different gadgets. For example, some parts of radio waves are used for Wi-Fi, some are used for local TVs, and some are used for cell phones. The reason why different gadgets use different waves to communicate is to avoid too much interference while communicating. It is so important that different countries have regulations on the frequencies they are allowed to use. The big problem when it comes to having thousands of satellites in space communicating at the same time for just internet connectivity would interfere with the few other satellites put up there for other purposes. These few other satellites are useful for things like navigation, weather forecasting, and global communications. Without these few satellites working properly, it is almost pointless to have an internet connection, given how important they are, and let's not forget the negative impact they would have on the environment. What many fail to remember is that while satellites spend most of their lives in space, at a time when space congestion becomes an issue, some of these machines would someday have to be brought down. Decommissioning a single satellite costs a lot, let alone doing the same things to hundreds of satellites that stop working. Bringing them back to Earth is another issue on its own, as there are many safety hazards to consider, including large debris falling like burning meteors on local settlements, leading to loss of life and property. With over 50 Chinese satellites launched and at least 500 planned to be in orbit by December, what plan does Elon have in mind to counter this? Launching more satellites to compete against China is not the best option, especially considering the many problems we have just covered. As someone who deeply cares about the environment, it is unlikely that he would double down on his plan to launch more satellites. The simple answer on what happens next is quite disappointing, as it is highly unlikely that Elon, the CEO of multiple private companies, would even think of competing against a government-led project, especially when it promises to provide the same thing he does, but much better. Given his history of turmoil with Russia, chances are Elon doesn't want to add fuel to the fire by going head-to-head against the Chinese government, despite the recent attack on his satellites. With that in mind, only time will tell what the future holds for both sides. So what do you think? Is China planning another attack? Should Elon continue to increase the total planned number of satellites? Let us know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Also, click on the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.